Howdy, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry about that. I got interrupted in the middle of a sentence by my phone telling me I needed to delete things to have space to make any more video. So, anyway, back again. Where was I? Yes, so we were talking about the beginning of the New Left, which was this kind of more radicalized viewpoint that became common on the college campuses of the 1960s. One famous incident related to the New Left is when there were actually violent protests at UC Berkeley in California. There's several incidents where students physically took over the universities to protest some of what was being taught there. One group of student protesters basically struck against the teaching of Western civilization because they associated Western civilization with imperialism and racism and conquest and so on. And so there's this really deep kind of radical strain of stuff that happens connected with this New Left. Some New Left groups turn violent. One of the most famous groups of them that did that was the so-called Weathermen, or the Weather Underground. They were a group of people that actually took up arms against the government and actually set off several bombs. So, I mean, there was quite a bit of political violence in the 60s and early 70s. Some of it connected to, obviously we talked about the assassinations, but then some of this connected as well to to this kind of New Left movement. And so among the New Left, they kind of made heroes out of a lot of revolutionary figures that were communist in nature, like Che Guevara, the Argentinian radical who was Castro's right-hand man in the revolution. Or some of them went so far as to literally... So I think, I'm trying to remember where the camera cut me off here. I think I had talked about how there was, within the anti-war movement, you had a handful of people that were just, pacifistic by nature. They didn't want war. They didn't want to risk the chance of nuclear problems, so they wanted to step down the Cold War, and that would have included Vietnam. You got another group of people that kind of are just starting to see that the Vietnam War isn't going well, and that we ought to do something different. But the heart and soul of the campus protest against Vietnam is actually... a lot of it was actually openly pulling for the North Vietnamese. Like some of them, there's, a famous actress from the period, famously took pictures on a North Vietnamese tank. Some of these radicals would fly North Vietnamese flags in their dorm rooms and stuff like this. And so there was a lot of terrifyingly radical thinking going around during this time, which is helps fuel a kind of just the cause and effect, push-pull, that kind of causes the pendulum to swing in another direction and leads to, ultimately, to Richard Nixon being elected president, largely on a platform of quote-unquote law and order. So the whole New Left and campus radicalism and all that was connected with a general rise of what they would call a counterculture, and which was a rejection of the mainstream of American life and a push toward new ways of doing things, and the people that really jumped in on this countercultural movement were given the nickname hippies because they were hip to the changes or hip to the scene or what have you. And typically, the hippies usually had been, oftentimes they were rich kids, occasionally middle class. Very rare that they were real poor working class people, but and they had grown up more materially well off than anyone. It hadn't really brought them the kind of satisfaction they expected. They didn't like some of the conformity that was required in in kind of the mainstream ways of doing society, whether it was, cutting their hair or I don't know, maybe I shouldn't be talking about these long-bearded hippies right now, but they while I'm wearing a tie-dyed shirt too, but they kind of, well, not tie-dyed, but it has a 60s hippie vibe, but they kind of turned against just a lot of just kind of ordinary life, and a lot of them joined communes and tried to share property. Quite a few of them got deep into drug addiction. And there's never been a period of time that I'm aware of that drug addiction was as bad as it was in the 60s and 70s. There had always been, drug abuse wasn't new. I mean, it was a thing back in the early parts of the 1900s. I mean, you can hear, references to, to drugs in songs that were written in the 1920s, but they were rare. But come the 1960s, when my buddy Carlos was rocking here, there were an awful lot of songs talking about it. And the reason for that was because the use of drugs had expanded tremendously, especially with the real introduction of psychedelics like LSD, which caused people to go on all these, trips where their senses would get messed up and taken in all sorts of different directions, and so this ideology kind of sprung up around it, and it expanded your consciousness and so on. And what it really turned into after a couple years of looking like, of the hippies acting like, the power of our love is about to turn around the fate of the world. But if you get by 1969, 1970, the condition that most of those hippies are living in is deep dissatisfaction, addiction, stuck on drugs. They're not able to really function properly in society. I mean, really, I love, one of the reasons I love the movie Forrest Gump. I mean, first off, every line of the movie is great, is part of it, but a lot of it really does show both how, in the character of Jenny, both how the whole hippie countercultural way of thinking attracted people, but also how it wound up really leaving people dried out and unfulfilled, and wasn't any more successful at filling the void in their life than the materialism of that they were reacting against was. And there was part of this whole, the counterculture was, one countercultural figure, I can't remember who it was, famously said, never trust anyone over the age of 30, which is very discordant with the biblical advice about following the wisdom of elders and so on. But not that they would have cared, but they were deeply distrustful of older generations, and deeply distrustful of the system, the way it had functioned. And some of them started to get into kind of like going back to nature in certain ways, or starting to, some of the hippies who did wound up finding something that they could do where they could make a little money, wound up moving. Like the original, like, first hub of the hippie movement is the Haight-Ashbury section of San Francisco, but it begins to spread to other parts of the country. And then once some of these hippies, particularly those that made music and things like that, where they actually found something where they could actually make a living and got a little money, a lot of them would go buy farms and stuff like that, and kind of try to, go into the countryside a little bit. And typically they rejected wearing, business clothes, suits and ties. Of course, I feel bad talking about this while I'm teaching a class in a rock and roll t-shirt and a ball cap, but maybe I'm more of a hippie than I give myself credit for. I don't know. No, I was way too square. I'd have been, they'd have called me a square back in '68 for sure. But you had this rejection of, like, formal means of dress. Famous for the long hair, the beards, the tie-dyed shirts, the color, girls with the flowers in the hair, all that kind of stuff. Kind of just a different, way of appearance. So there were some things that are, so there were some things about that era that that are on the more superficial side of things that are, that are cool enough. Like, I mean, obviously I've mentioned before, I mean, music, the music that went along with this whole kind of was fantastic, and there'll probably never be a better era of music for the rest of time. I don't know. But I can see why some people might like some of the other accoutrements to it, but the heart of the philosophy was really, really bankrupt and really, really wrong. And it led a lot of people into drug addiction. And the other thing besides drugs that they really rebelled against there being any sort of rules constraining sexual morality. And this actually starts to filter out of the counterculture and into the mainstream in the late 60s and early 70s, and becomes known as in sociology and stuff like that as what they call the sexual revolution, which is the period of time where people really start to turn against, you know, abstaining until marriage. I mean, obviously, people had committed fornication throughout history, but up until that point, there had at least been the cultural consensus that that's what you're supposed to do. People start rebelling against that as the idea of what you're supposed to do. You see the rise of what they call hookup culture, where people would just, have one night stands or whatever. Ultimately, that's going to move into becoming accepting of, different perversions. Um, and so you wind up with a lot of people really broken by this stuff, because that's not the way we were designed to live. I mean, God designed us, not to, be passing ourselves around from person to person. And so you wind up, and this fuels there was a little bit of a rise in divorce rates that had happened in the late 50s, early 60s anyway. That starts to go through the roof in the 60s and 70s as people really begin to throw off restraint. And because of that, I mean, your generation, you're really very fortunate if your two birth parents are living together, married right now. I had a friend who was a kindergarten teacher, and she said she had a class of 25 kids, and only one kid had their two parents living together by the time they were 5, and they kind of like thought he was weird, like, your mommy and daddy live together? I mean, and that is heartbreaking, but it really begins with the selfishness of this generation from the 60s. But at the same time, you can't entirely blame the 60s, because where did this come from? There was obviously problems in the way that the previous generation had handled things that enabled, this much depth of rebellion and so forth. So they were typically a lot, in addition to, wanting to cast off all restraint as far as that sort of thing. They also, there was a lot of flirtation with like Eastern mysticism. And so the 60s and 70s, you have something that's called the New Age movement, where people started to like draw on a lot of like, on kind of watered down versions of Eastern religions like Buddhism, and various occultic type things, which got a lot of people into spiritual bondage, because they started messing around with things they didn't understand and opened themselves up to the demonic realm. And so there was a lot of social trends that accompany this counterculture that were very bad for America, even though there were some superficial things that were relatively benign, and even though there was a few things like just the general people being a little more casual in their dress and stuff that may not have happened without that as an influence at some point. But in terms of like the actual important things, like the overall moral philosophy and the way people lived, it was very, very detrimental to American culture. Behind all of the stuff, the reason why they practiced what they called free love, which turned out not to be so free, cost them dearly a lot of times, and emotional levels and all kinds of ways. Beyond the drug use, beyond the radical politics, beyond all that, there was a general sense of a morality that was oriented around, if it feels good, do it. Around, don't let anyone tell you how to live. About you, be true to yourself. And this stuff filtered deep into American culture, so deep that it's, very difficult to uproot from the way that American culture thinks today. And a lot of it is very destructive, because there's because while, I do believe, strongly in allowing people to be, individual in terms of being who God made them to be and so on, and not, I don't like conformity and forcing people into, systems and stuff, but at the same time, like, if it feels good, do it is a terrible way to run a society, because there's certain things that, when God calls things sins, He calls them sins because it's because He cares about us, right? He's not doing this so that He can see how many rules He can follow. He's doing it because He knows that it's going to introduce brokenness and introduce problems into people's lives. And so you've got a lot of us are walking around wounded because people that we knew, did something that felt good to them, that wound up hurting their children, hurting their families, hurting their friends, hurting their, people that they were connected with in life. And so So there was a lot of it's really easy to kind of romanticize the hippie era because of uh, you know because of the rhetoric of peace and love and harmony that they like to use. But behind all that, there was actually a very harmful philosophy. I took a shot in one video. I can't remember if it was in your class or another class, but I took a shot in one video at the John Lennon song "Imagine," which was loved by even though it came out a little later, it was loved by people that were in this movement when it did. And there's lines in that song that people thought was utopian that are like, imagine there's no heaven, imagine nothing around us. Well, that's exactly the philosophy that got us in trouble, was this idea that we don't have to care about any sort of accountability to anybody but ourselves. We don't have to worry about anything but what our own personal desires are. And that kind of selfishness was like an atom bomb on the family structure of America, and caused a lot of chaos. Thankfully, the Lord did some amazing things in the midst of that. Like, you had kind of simultaneous to all this kind of, a lot of people coming into spiritual ruin and decay from all this countercultural stuff. You also had, the Jesus movement, which is